Well, hello again everybody, and here we are again. I'm recording this on Maundy Thursday of 2020. So I have some thoughts, topical thoughts I think, for today about Maundy Thursday. I've been thinking a lot about this today. Normally I'd have been in church, but of course with the lockdown nobody's in church. It's a key day for Christians. It's the origin of the Eucharist, the communion service or Mass. It's the day when Jesus gave us a new commandment, and that actually is where the origin of the word Maundy is. It's a corruption of a Latin word mandatum, and mandatum means a command, as in the English word mandate. It's a central act for Christians of all denominations, whether they're Catholics, Protestants or Orthodox. The idea of celebrating together the meal, the Last Supper, it's just a central event. Without it, there is almost no church. So what happened, when did it happen, and where did it happen? Well, first of all, it's linked to the Jewish Passover. The Gospel accounts are all pretty clear about this, and those are related also to Jesus' entry to Jerusalem. So thus we know what week it was, and we're not entirely sure which day of the week it was. There's quite an extensive debate about this as to which day of the week it was, and whether it was on the Wednesday or the Thursday or Friday or whichever. Anyway, that debate is too long for now. Which year was it? That's an interesting question. There's a long debate about that. Mostly it boils down to it was either 30 or it was 33 AD, as we would now call it. Where was it? Well, it was in Jerusalem, or perhaps just slightly outside, a suburb of Jerusalem, maybe an area called Bethany. We know that it was in the upper room of a house, and this would have been quite typical, quite traditional for Jewish life of that day. We don't know exactly where that was. There are several places now which claim ownership of the site. There's St Mark's Syrian Orthodox Church, which has very early claim to that. There's also the Church of the Cenacle or the Koinaculum on Mount Zion. But the truth of the matter is we're not entirely sure exactly where it was. Wherever it was in Jerusalem somewhere. What actually happened at the Last Supper? Well, there are a number of key things in the whole story. Jesus washed his disciples' feet. To the objection of St Peter at first, who eventually gave in, this is Jesus showing his service to his disciples who were his followers. So he's kind of reversing the roles. So the leader becomes the servant of all. This is replicated in many church services on Maundy Thursday traditionally, and indeed Pope Francis of the Roman Catholic Church has done this famously in recent times, washing the feet of prisoners, slightly to the disapproval of some of the more traditionalists in the Catholic Church. There was also the occasion where Jesus revealed that he knew someone was going to betray him, and he identified that traitor as going to be Judas Iscariot. And this incidentally tells us that Judas was actually pretty close to Jesus at the meal, perhaps sitting next to him, or maybe one away from that. After that, of course, Judas then left the meal. He's famously shown leaving the meal in a number of famous paintings, notably the one by Tintoretto, and so identifying him as the guilty man. He, of course, had betrayed Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. He'd taken the money from the authorities, but he was then overcome with guilt and went out and hanged himself. And he's become a great sort of villainous figure over the centuries, maybe just showing the weakness that many of us also have. But then there was the meal, and I was wondering, I've been wondering for the past few days, what would have been on the menu. Now we know that for certain there were two things. One of them was there was wine, and the other is that there was unleavened bread. Now, if this was any sort of a traditional Passover meal, which it may well have been, it's very likely there would also have been lamb, which goes back to the story in the Old Testament of killing a lamb and then cooking it and smearing the blood on the door so that the destroyer will pass by those houses. And we also know about unleavened bread. It's quite possible that there would have been some other traditional dishes there. There's a slow-cooked bean stew, which I've always thought sounds rather nice, called haroset. So maybe it was a mixture of lamb and bean stew and matzo, which is the unleavened bread. Nowadays that comes out as crackers. Did it look like it does in the most famous rendering of it of all by Leonardo on the wall of the refectory of Santa Maria delle Grazie in Milan? Well, probably not, because it's unlikely that Jesus and the disciples actually sat down at a table. It's much more likely that there was a low table on which the food was served, and they would have been sitting on the floor or perhaps reclining on some covers near that, but it's unlikely to have been a more formal banquet as shown by Leonardo, Tintoretto and other people too. At that meal, it was also said that Peter would deny Jesus, and he said he wouldn't, but of course we know from the Gospel accounts that actually after the cock crowed a third time on the next day, then he did indeed deny Jesus and came to realise with all the guilt that went with that what Jesus had said had come true. And there's also, Jesus effectively gives his last testament or a sermon, or this is the command, and he says, I give you this commandment. And it's a fairly long sort of testament to basic, and it forms the basis of a lot of Christian belief, Orthodox Christian belief. But the key thing for us today, I think, is I give you this one commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. And so that's the thought I'd like to leave you with today, that Maundy Thursday, yes, it's about do this in remembrance of me, but it's also about love one another.